Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather, and today I'd like to talk you through some myth retellings that I really enjoyed. Now, I never thought of myself as a person who loved all sorts of mythological retellings, but as I started going through my shelves, I noticed I had a lot more than I thought I did. This is all in celebration of the fact that Ariadne by Jennifer Saint has just been published. This is the UK edition, but it is out both in the UK and in the US. And first of all, this book is just stunning. Look at that. Secondly, it tells the story of Ariadne of Naxos, who I feel was a much overlooked character in Greek mythology. I'm sure there are Greek scholars out there who would disagree with that, and please do let me know. But nonetheless, she was the young woman responsible for teaching Theseus how to get through the labyrinth and defeat the Minotaur, in exchange for which they fell in love and he helped her run away from her home and her family, but after a while grew tired of her and abandoned her on the island of Naxos. So Jennifer Saint decides to retell that story, which I think sounds incredible. In celebration of that book being released, I thought I would look through some of my other mythological retellings. So first, let's start with Greek mythology, as that seems to be the most common type of myth retelling. And if you want to just get a handle on Greek mythology to start with, I would recommend Mythos by Stephen Fry, in which he retells all of Greek mythology from the very beginning of the gods all the way through the most obscure gods in a really accessible and often quite funny way, as only Stephen Fry can do. If you enjoy this book, there are two sequels as well, including Heroes, where he tells the Greek myths that do not feature gods necessarily, but heroes, such as Theseus, Hercules, Orpheus, so on, and Perseus, so on and so forth. There is also a third in which he retells the Trojan Wars, but I have not read that one just yet. If you read and enjoyed anything having to do with Greek mythology, particularly the Odyssey or the Iliad, then you have to read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Everyone has talked about this book by now. It is wildly popular and with very good reason. This tells the story of Achilles, hero of the Trojan War, from the perspective of his friend and indeed lover, Patroclus. There is debate within the Iliad itself whether Achilles and Patroclus were just dear friends or were they lovers. Madeline Miller takes the perspective that yes, they were lovers, and with that is able to weave a beautiful, incredible love story that will stay with you forever. Similarly, Madeline Miller also retold the story of Circe, who you may remember if you ever read the Odyssey, as the witch who convinced Odysseus and his men to stay on her island for 7 years after having turned his men into pigs for a while. This book doesn't only tell this portion, but it tells Circe's entire beginning and how she in fact interacted with many more characters in Greek mythology than she is often given credit for, including Daedalus, the creation of the Minotaur that Theseus later goes on to destroy, so on and so forth. It was another incredible read. If, like Ariadne or Circe, catches your eye in terms of female-centric retellings of Greek mythology, I would also recommend The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which is a wonderful story, and it retells the aftermath of the Trojan Wars from the perspective of the women involved. I found this incredibly moving and really interesting. It was a bit of a Marmite. Other people preferred other retellings, and that's perfectly valid. but I still think this is a very good and interesting look at that particular perspective. In addition, A Thousand Ships by Natalie Haynes also looks at the women of the Trojan War, and I have heard other amazing things about this retelling as well, though I haven't read it myself yet. Finally, if you're looking for something a bit more unusual in terms of a Greek myth retelling, I would recommend Workin' on a Song, the lyrics of Hadestown by Anais Mitchell. Hadestown is an incredible musical that retells the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, using the myth of Hades and Persephone as a backdrop as well, and how the two stories intertwine. It also then uses that story to tackle environmentalism, conservatism, industrialization, and the Trump administration all in one. It is one of the single most moving and beautiful productions I have ever seen. And I am so pleased to have this book that not only contains all of its lyrics, which is thus the entire musical, but to also have Anais Mitchell's notes about how those lyrics evolved over the play's creation. Please excuse if you can hear any thunder or the steady darkening of my room, as the thunderstorm rolled in a lot sooner than the weatherman predicted it was going to. Another group of myths that I really enjoy are Celtic myths, and these come in a variety of forms, as each Celtic country produced its own myths and legends. The variety that I have the most of are Arthurian myths and legends. If you are a fan of classic Arthurian legend, such as the musical Camelot or the film The Sword and the Stone, I would recommend The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is divided into 4 books, the first of which is The Sword in the Stone, which formed the basis for the Disney film. That book, of course, tells the story of Arthur when he is a child, and the other 3 books tell the story of the development of his reign and its ultimate downfall. There are many more female-centric retellings of the Arthurian legends, however. The next up, which has become almost a classic in and of itself, is The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. I remember reading this in high school and being riveted from beginning to end, as it tells the story of many of the women in Arthurian legend that are often counted as witches, and bringing back its roots in Celtic religion. And because the ancient Celtic religions were being ousted by the rise of Christianity in Britain, often its priestesses were relabeled as witches. And so this retelling gives those women a voice, particularly Morgaine, who is often sometimes known as Morgan Le Fay, who in traditional retellings is cast as the villain of the piece. I adored this book. I found it absolutely fascinating. Do read it. Thirdly, there is also the series that begins with Guinevere, Queen of the Summer Country by Rosalind Miles. Rosalind Miles wrote a number of books about Celtic myths, including this series. She had another trilogy about the legend of Tristan and Isolde, but I enjoyed this one most. And this, again, retells the story of the Arthurian legends and the transition from Druidic religion to Christianity during that period and the turmoil that that created from the perspective of Guinevere, King Arthur's future wife. I adored these books when I was growing up. I think I started reading them when I was 13, but they still made a huge impact on me. In addition, they have some incredible, useful footage, such as a map of the ancient kingdoms of Britain, a family tree, a list of important people and places, and my personal favorite, the Celtic Wheel of the Year, listing all of the major holidays for Celts and other Druidic religions and what those celebrated. I still reference this sometimes. It's fantastic. That trilogy is continued in the books The Knight of the Sacred Lake and The Child of the Holy Grail. Finally, there is the book The Lost Queen by Signe Pike, which I read in the summer of 2019 and adored. You don't even really notice that it's based on Arthurian legends except for one little snippet, which is the fact that Langoreth's brother is a warrior and a druid known to history as Merlin, which any of you who know Welsh know that that is a version of Merlin's name. And of course, the Arthurian legends were of Welsh creation. This tells the story of his sister and their family and the struggles that she faces both romantically and, again, in terms of allegiances to the old ways and the old religion versus Christianity and the new religion. I loved this one, and the sequel should be coming out this summer, which I am very, very excited for. In a similar vein, we have Norse mythology, because of course the Viking invasions led to some interesting crossover and certainly similarities between Celtic mythology and Norse mythology, particularly in tone. So if you're looking to just find out what Norse mythology actually entails, I would recommend reading Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. Yes, Neil Gaiman gives his own particular spin on each of these stories, but they do stay true to the original stories. After all, these stories were originally oral stories, so they would have been changed and tweaked by each storyteller down the line. In terms of retellings, I would first recommend The Gospel of Loki by Joanne Harris. Yes, this is the same Joanne Harris who wrote Chocolat, but this has a very different tone, and this retells all of Greek mythology from its beginnings through to Ragnarok from Loki's perspective. And Loki is everything that you would expect him to be. She nails his character. He is charming, he is flirtatious, he is also annoying and quite arrogant. But all of that together make for a fascinating narrator. And in a similar vein, a book I recently read, The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek, which also retells Norse mythology, particularly some of Loki's stories, but from the perspective of Angrboda, who was the mother of 3 of Loki's children, who all would go on to play parts in Ragnarok. I adored the way this book was told. I think it brought really wonderful perspectives, and I would highly recommend it. Similarly, I would also recommend Neil Gaiman's book Odd and the Frost Giants, which is a retelling of one Norse myth in particular, but for children. And it is a wonderful read, very whimsical, very true to the original, but it is very difficult to get off my shelves, so I will just insert a picture here. In terms of mythologies that are further afield, I would next recommend the series that begins with The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, and this looks at Russian folklore, which I know very little about, but I loved what I was able to discover in this story. This tells the story of Vasya, who's a young girl out in the Russian countryside, whose mother has died when she is quite young. And so years later, her father remarries, and her stepmother is less inclined to honor the old traditions of honoring house spirits, wood spirits, the frost god, all of those beings, in favor of the rise of Christianity. And it takes Vasya to keep those old ways alive. And she discovers that she is in fact a kind of chosen one. I found this story beautiful and engaging. The entire trilogy was fast-paced and gripping, and I loved every single second of it. It continues from The Bear and the Nightingale with The Girl in the Tower and The Winter of the Witch. For some Middle Eastern folklore and fairy tales, I would recommend The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh. This is based on the 1001 Arabian Nights, but not those fairy tales specifically. It is more focused on the backstory, the framing story for the Arabian Nights. So in this story, the ruler of the land takes a new wife every night, and in the morning she is killed. And one of Shazi's best friends was one of those wives. And so now Shazi, or Scheherazade, decides that she is going to become his next wife and take her revenge. But in the meantime, we're also seeing the backstory of why the Caliph takes a new wife and has to have her killed. And is it in fact taking a toll on him? And can these two perspectives come to meet? I found it absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed the first book. The second book was good. I didn't enjoy it as much, but I really loved this first book. And for a book that pulls from all sorts of different mythologies, I would recommend American Gods by Neil Gaiman, which of course now is famous for being a television show. I have not watched the show, so I don't know how it compares to the book, but I really enjoyed the novel when I read it a few years ago. It tells the story of Shadow, who has just been released from prison and is trying to rebuild his life from rock bottom, and is offered a job by the mysterious Mr. Wednesday. And as he begins to work for Mr. Wednesday, he begins to realize there's much more going on that is far more supernatural than he ever thought possible. This pulls mainly from Norse mythology, but it also pulls from many other kinds of mythologies, because the premise is that all sorts of immigrant groups, when they came to North America, brought their gods and their myths with them. And so thus, Norse gods can be interacting with Native American gods and jinn and fairies from Celtic mythology, and all sorts of creatures can be living together in America, and what a crazy mix of magic that would bring. I really enjoyed it and would highly recommend it. So those are my myth retelling recommendations, but I am always hungry for more, especially from cultures and myth genres that I'm not familiar with. If you know of any that you think I would like, please recommend them in the comments down below. And until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.